quick note before we begin. If we are unable to interact with other beings, especially in the very early years of our lives, we will not develop a proper and functioning sense of self. Now, there are very few cases in which human beings have been raised in true isolation to see this. There are some cases of either what are known as feral children or children of nature, children who have been lost at very early years and raised either in the wild or by various wild animals, and they will oftentimes have a stunted sense of self and different perceptions than a conventional human being. Other studies have shown or specifically looked at what happens when we raise the children or babies of great apes in complete isolation, and it is very problematic for their mental development. They often turn out to be fairly mentally challenged or mentally stunted, you could say, and they do not oftentimes show many of the hallmarks of a sense of self like the other great apes or great apes raised in normal situations would. For example, a chimpanzee raised completely by itself will not react to seeing its own image in the mirror. It will fail a dot test and oftentimes is just largely apathetic. There are pretty horrible experiments that have been done. I'm not sure that we still do such experiments, but I cannot speak to that 100%. Please let this remind you, there is oftentimes constant conflict between sort of Eastern and Western traditions, between individualism and collectivism, and while there are differences, as we've talked about much throughout this lecture set and previous lectures, and we will continue to do so in future lectures, please remember that without a group, there could be no individuals. You would just not develop into an individual. And further, without individuals, you would not have any groups, at least as far as Homo sapiens are concerned. You could say that strawberries can just keep cloning each other, or potatoes for that matter, and you could have a group of potatoes that are all genetically identical, but that's not how we work. At the end of the day, you require both things to have functioning human beings, right? So arguing about which one is greater or better is ultimately a matter of preference. There is no objective truth to that one. It's very similar to how for a long time scientists debated the difference between nature and nurture and finally all had to put their egos aside and settle on that it's an interaction of both. Like most things that we'll talk about, the world is rarely so simple as to have just one unified driver of complex behavior, and it's oftentimes interactions of multiple things. Social comparison theory is the idea that we learn about our own abilities and attitudes by comparing ourselves to others around us. Well, technically, they don't have to be around us. That's just the most common people that we compare ourselves to. These types of comparisons can be divided into two categories. I mean, I'm sure there are exceptions, but for the most part, they fit into these. The first is upward social comparisons. These refer to comparing ourselves to people who are better at us than in some regard or particular trait or ability. We tend to perform these types of comparisons when our goals are centered around either excellence for ourselves or the desire to improve certain qualities or traits about ourselves. It should be noted that these can be highly motivational, but they can also be difficult to accept when we compare ourselves to people who are too much greater than we are and can oftentimes be dispiriting. So the people with whom we compare ourselves in this fashion should also be thought about. It should be, well, should be is prescriptive, but ideally one makes a comparison to someone who is not so far beyond our skill level that it makes us lose all hope that we could ever get there. Rather, it is a more effective strategy to continually compare yourself to someone who is a little bit better than you and continually strive to reach their level. And upon reaching their level, to just reshift that comparison to someone who is again a little bit better than you. This way, those goals are relatively tangible and achievable as opposed to comparing yourself to someone who is decades ahead of you, perhaps. The other type of comparison are downward social comparisons, and these refer to comparing ourselves to people who are worse than we are with regard to a particular trait or ability. And we often perform these types of comparisons when we are not feeling very good about ourselves or we need an ego boost, and this is a way to make us feel satisfied with our current state of being. Now, that is the large majority of how these types of comparisons happen, even though we tend to see this in another place as well. One often finds these types of comparisons when significant trauma or ailments afflict us, and it can be used as a means of coping. Your text gives the example of cancer wards, and oftentimes those suffering from severe and often terminal cancers will make comparisons to people who are suffering even worse than them as a means of giving themselves hope that all is not yet lost. Another interesting phenomenon that takes place with other people is referred to as social tuning, and this is the process whereby people adopt one another's attitudes. Well, specifically, that we're talking about us adopting somebody else's attitudes, but this is oftentimes a reciprocal process working on both sides. This happens a tremendous amount among friend and peer groups, and often people's tastes will already be similar, and this is something that brings them all together. But those tastes will continue to fall more and more in line as time progresses through this social tuning process. And this refers to behaviors and mannerisms as well. If you look at longtime friends, oftentimes they will have all manner of little mannerisms that are very similar to each other. This is also found when we are idolizing certain people who are in charge of us, or when you have certain power differentials in relationships. You will again see that those who have lower power status will oftentimes emulate those who have higher power status as a means of ingratiating themselves towards them. We'll talk a little bit more about ingratiation, I think, in two parts. Just one random side note, I guess, for this part. One oftentimes hears these conflicting statements. Birds of a feather flock together. This just means, in case you're not familiar with, that people who are like tend to come together. And the opposite statement that also gets passed around a lot is that opposites attract, meaning people who are different from each other are drawn to each other. Now, by and large, research has shown that the former is true more often, and it will result in much more longer lasting relationships, be they intimate or platonic. When it comes to opposites attracting, yes, there can be some unbelievably immense initial attraction for opposites, again, romantic or platonic, but at the end of the day, unless shared interests are developed, those relationships do not tend to last as long as relationships among people who are similar to each other. At the end of the day, human beings just prefer to be around people who are like them. This is, well, there can be many arguments. Everything from the tribal nature of human beings to we currently live in a society where diversity and discussion and debate are not actually encouraged. To see an empirical demonstration of this, I thought it was quite an interesting experiment, even though if one really wanted to argue with it, there are some interesting points that one could bring up. Regardless, Sinclair, Lowery, Hardin, and Colangelo, say it like that, I guess, in 2005 wrote a paper called Social Tuning of Automatic Racial Attitudes, the Role of Affiliative Motivation. So the way this experiment worked is the participant came to the laboratory and they were greeted by the experimenter. And the experimenter was either nice or abrasive. The way in which this was conducted is there was a sort of fishbowl full of candy, and the friendly or nice experimenter would give them some candy and be like, thank you for participating. I know you're getting credit, but here, have some candy too. And the abrasive one, same person, would move the candy jar out of reach and say something to the effect of, oh, my colleagues think it's great to give candy to you participants, but I think the fact that you get credit is more than enough, so just accept that, or something like this. So those are the two conditions around the experimenter's kindness or abrasiveness. Further, half the time the experimenter is wearing a t-shirt that expresses anti-racism sentiments, and the other half of the time they're wearing a blank shirt. So this is what you would call a 2x2 design, such that half the time in the friendly condition they're wearing the anti-racism, and half the time in the friendly they're wearing a blank shirt, and the same for the abrasive condition, hence the 4 bars in this diagram. Now, following this, the participant takes part in a modified version of the dot probe task. I'll explain this in a second, and they respond to the words good and bad with a button press. So the way a dot probe task works is that you are responding to the location of a dot. In this case, they're actually responding to the words good and bad. And what happens is the dot will either be on the right or left hand of the screen, same with the words. But right before the dot appears, a face is oftentimes flashed on the screen, and this face will be of different ethnicities. In this case, it is black and white faces, and it is a means of testing implicit bias, because depending on how someone is focusing on the images presented, you can get a cue of where their sort of subtle bias is towards what types of face, and you can look at discrepancies in reaction times to calculate this bias. Okay, so here's what they found. For the likable condition, that is these two bars here, this is just a baseline of 0. So this would be if they responded to both good and bad with the faces flashed to them at exactly the same rate. Now, when the yellow bars are for the blank shirt, the red bars are the anti-racism shirt. So here the experimenter was nice to them. They offered them some candy, and it was found that the people in that condition had less automatic prejudice when the experimenter was wearing the anti-racism shirt, and had a greater level of prejudice when the kind experimenter was wearing a blank shirt. You see the opposite pattern when the experimenter was unlikable. Here, when they were wearing the anti-racism shirt, the bias reflected in the participants is actually greater than when the experimenter is wearing a blank shirt. Now, how this relates to social tuning: when the experimenter was likable and expressed sentiments of anti-racism, the participants brought their own opinions and biases in line with this situation, resulting in them having a lower degree of prejudice. You see the opposite pattern here, where the unlikable person is not someone to whom you want to tune, and therefore the opposite pattern happens when they're wearing this anti-racism shirt, thus resulting in an increase in the automatic bias of these participants. Now, just a note a couple things actually. First, the use of an automatic prejudice scale here is interesting. A lot of the implicit metrics are designed so that our own control cannot influence them. So it is intriguing that such ultimately subtle manipulation could result in such drastic differences in our implicit or automatic bias. That is a debate that is continually going on in prejudice literature, and unless you're steeped in it, it's not something you probably have to care about. Number two, this has some pretty interesting real-world implications. For example, if I am an egalitarian and I am expressing my views of egalitarianism, if you like me, chances are you will also begin to like views of egalitarianism. But there's a more insidious thing that this implies. If you hate me, or you think I am so different than you that I cannot be tolerated, even if you, to some degree, let's say, harbor egalitarian norms, will you harbor those less, seeing as how me, someone you dislike, harbors egalitarian norms? And would you then perhaps advocate for more dominance-based norms? Now, this could be reflected today in our political climate around all of the protests going on centered around racial equality, and how there's such a stark divide between people, and how, well, to be honest, the aggressions and hatreds are quite strong these days. It is worth considering how much these can exacerbate and influence the different ideologies and perspectives that these groups are having when there is such strong emotionality involved across this divide. Even though people are expressing relatively straightforward considerations along these ideological grounds, perhaps in the interpretation of these, it is a little bit more complicated. Just something to think about. I'm not proposing to have any type of answer in one way or another. It's just one of those things with the more you know, the more there is to think about, and the more you realize how little we really know. One last bit to cover is affective forecasting, and this refers to our ability to predict how we will feel in the future in response to some type of emotional event. right? Like, how happy would I be if I win the lottery? How sad will I be if I have a rough breakup? At the end of the day, we are very accurate at predicting the valence. I will be happy when I win the lottery. I will be sad when the breakup happens. This is valence, the good or badness of the emotional state. We are, however, horribly inaccurate at predicting both the intensity and duration of those emotional states. Intensity is just implying the severity with which we feel it, how happy or how sad we are, and duration is, I'm hoping, self-explanatory. It's the time that we feel the emotional state. At the end of the day, we consistently overestimate both of these qualities. We think that we will be happier longer or sadder longer than we actually are in reality. This is reliably the case. There are some very stark graphs centered around happiness of people who win the lottery, and oftentimes you will see a tremendous spike in their happiness right after they win the lottery, and with a year their happiness levels are exactly the same as before they won the lottery. Which is saying something. I mean, a lot of that gets used to talk about how money is not necessarily related to happiness, but at the end of the day, this is found in a lot of states. And while we are incredibly emotional beings, we are not constantly on emotional roller coasters. For much of the time, we experience emotional events that cause us to feel emotions, but then we come back to whatever our baseline happens to be. There are, of course, some exceptions to this. Things like generalized anxiety or depression are long emotional states, but they're compounded with other complex cognitive and mental states as well. On this notion of affective forecasting, when it comes to, well, consider this first. Which of the following is more likely to result in you going to the movies? Seeing a really good critic's review of a movie that is playing at the movie theater, or a recommendation from a friend to go see that movie? Just giving you a second. Ultimately, both could result in you wanting to go to the movies, and that's totally fine. When it comes to many situations in the world, we often are going to try and predict how we will feel at the conclusion of those situations. And in many situations, it turns out that having some knowledge about how other people felt in that particular situation is a better predictor of how we will feel than some factual pieces of information we know about said event. So dating is a prime example of this. And in today's world, the comparison would be comparing a dating profile in which you have some information about these individuals versus a friend's recommendation, something to the effect of, I think you would like this person. In many cases, the friend's recommendation will actually result in us being happier overall than using some set of individual characteristics that we decide we either like or don't like. A lot of times this is related to how we talked about the intangibleness of certain feelings that don't fit into pro-con lists. A friend can have a feeling that they can pass on to you, whereas we cannot oftentimes quantify those feelings in something like a dating profile.